advantage of crime.
You make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on. Call in now. 855-4-SHIP. That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories, your freedom. The Peter Schiff Show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter Schiff. Peter is testifying before Congress today about job creation, so I rather suspect that's a YouTube we're going to want to see. It's a beautiful thing to imagine Peter there, people finally listening to him. We can only hope. So I've done Peter a big favor, of course, not sitting in on the program, which is a pleasure, but I watched the entire Republican presidential debate last night, so I'd have something to say to you folks about it this morning. And for any of you who watched it, I'm sure you similarly viewed this as a chore, an unspeakable drudgery, but that's a price we have to pay to have something to say at the water cooler the next day. So let's go through a few highlights or lowlights of what we were subjected to the other night. First of all, I found it very interesting. Right after the event, CNN had a poll, and in that poll you could vote for Bachmann, Perry, or Romney, even though CNN's own poll showed Ron Paul 6 points ahead of Bachmann. So, I mean, it's our Soviet media. What can you say? What can you say? So I found it interesting. All right, so how are you going to cut the budget? What are you going to cut? And everybody says, oh, we got to cut, and there's just too much spending. We got to cap spending as a percentage of GDP, and all the usual sorts of propaganda. But I was listening to Ron Paul's answer, and of course, part of his answer is we got to cut, in part, some of the money from the wars. You can't really be waging 6 wars when you're broke, so probably got to start there. But then he said we got to start cutting some of the cabinet departments. And it's just, I find that so refreshing that somebody actually says this. That maybe we have to look at the Department of Energy or the Department of Education. Now, of course, most listeners, unfortunately, will think that you want to cut the Department of Education. That means you like ignorance. You hate education. But to the contrary, it's interesting to note that when the Department of Education was created, I think it was 1979, and it opened its doors in 1980. I mean, first of all, we should recall, I think, I wouldn't exactly say that American life before 1979 was just an unremitting wasteland of ignorance. But all the same, the New York Times editorialized against the Department of Education. The Washington Post editorialized against the Department of Education. The president of the American Federation of Teachers editorialized against the Department of Education. They said one more bureaucracy is not going to solve the educational problems. If the school system is bad, well, it's got to be dealt with at the local level. It's not just adding another layer of badness doesn't solve the problem. But today, so in other words, in 1979, it was possible for you to be on the left and say, I'm against the Department of Education. Today, if you're on the right, it's considered vaguely cheeky and really daring to be against the Department of Education. That's how the allowable range of political opinion has shrunk in this country, right? I mean, things that were open to the left to say are now today considered to be, almost kind of crossing the line even for a conservative. That's what we got going on here. Now, you might think, well, maybe the reason that these debates are so lacking in substance or you're just pulling your hair out watching them is that, you still have 8 candidates. How are you going to get 8 people saying something of substance? But I'm telling you, I remember the 2008 election cycle. It was down to 4 candidates. It was Huckabee, Paul, McCain, and Romney. So you think, all right, well, now this time, they're sitting around a little table. Now we'll get some real back and forth. But instead, Huckabee and Paul were just more or less left out. And it was a debate between McCain and Romney over the most trivial and absurd issues, like what number of troops would you withdraw on what date, and what number would you deploy on what other date completely trivial, inane differences between them. And finally, Ron Paul says, instead of arguing about who would deploy what when, why don't we talk about whether we should be doing this in the first place? Like, why don't we ask some fundamental questions? So I thought, aha, now that's the very interesting moment in the debate, right, when the whole debate has been blown open by Ron Paul, when he finally says this whole thing is a scam. And so afterward, they've got the usual David Gergen and all these commentators talking about it. And they say, all right, so what did you think was the turning point of the debate? Well, there certainly was a clear turning point, they said. It was when Romney said that he would deploy troops 3 days earlier than McCain. This is just unbelievable. It's like Pravda, or it's like watching Soviet television. I liked last night they were talking to Romney. Now, Romney's decided he's not going to criticize the Federal Reserve. He's not going to criticize the Fed. To the contrary, he's perfectly happy with the job Ben Bernanke's been doing. He said this. He has come out and said this. Bernanke's doing a good job in a difficult situation, so I'm not going to be criticizing the Fed in this campaign. Now, politically, that probably makes sense for Romney. I mean, the Fed is still, although more people are paying attention to it, is not probably a swing issue for a lot of voters. And probably people who care a lot about the Fed are voting for Ron Paul anyway, so there's no sense in Romney wasting his time on it. I'm sure that's his calculation here. So last night he says, look, yeah, sure, there needs to be a little bit of oversight over at the Fed. Make sure they're behaving properly. Translation, nothing will change under Romney, right? That's obviously what that means. But then he goes on to say, well, who's going to manage our currency if we didn't have the Fed? The only other choice would be the U.S. Congress, and I certainly don't want that. Well, I agree with that. I don't want Pelosi dollars and McCain dollars any more than I want Bernanke dollars. So, I mean, he's right as far as he goes. But, there is a third option. And we don't say, well, gee, if the federal government isn't producing shoes, who's going to do it? Who's going to produce shoes if the federal government doesn't produce? Well, you know what? Maybe the market. There is this free market system that we neglect when instead we want to have half of every transaction being money, in effect interfered with by the Federal Reserve with its monopoly money and its interest rate manipulations. It is a central planning agency that whose damaging effects are felt economy-wide. But you're not going to hear that from Romney. You're not going to hear anything about business cycles or anything else from any of these guys. I love the question that the kid answered. All right, so I go out and work. How much out of every dollar that I earn do you guys think I deserve to keep? How much do I deserve? How much am I entitled to? Well, a great question, right? Great question. Gets no answer. They asked John Huntsman. John Huntsman is the candidate the media is pleading with you to like, right? They've featured him way more than his numbers would seem to demand. They're begging you. They're the same way they were with Tim Pawlenty. Please like this guy. We already picked him in advance, for heaven's sake. Why don't you at least do us the courtesy of liking him, for heaven's sake? So they asked Huntsman that question, and he goes off about his tax plan. But just answer the question, how much money do you think people are entitled to when they earn it? Good question. But I think if I were asked that question about what do you do with that guy who's got no insurance and he's in a coma for 6 months? I mean, it's a typical kind of question that they're going to ask a Republican candidate, right? I mean, Republicans have got to be ready for a question like that. So they asked Ron Paul that question. They asked Bachmann that question. And the way I would answer that is as follows. That obviously, in this world, there are a lot of situations that are extremely difficult to handle. But ask yourself this. Suppose there was no welfare state. Suppose there was nothing. Wouldn't you be volunteering to help people a lot more than you are now? Wouldn't you be donating to causes a lot more than you are now? If you were a lawyer, would you be providing pro bono services more than you are now? If you were a physician, would you be providing pro bono services more than you are now? Would you be volunteering at an adult literacy center more than you are now? Then why aren't you doing it now? Because you bought into the idea that some other sucker's going to do it for you. Well, we're broke. We can't live that philosophy anymore. Bastiat says the state is the great fiction by which everyone attempts to live at the expense of everyone else. But we're running out of everyone else. We're running out of the dough. It can't be done anymore. And it's not compassionate to run out of money so that no one will be able to be cared for. All right, stick around. You're listening to Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show. to President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America. We're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods, in for Peter, who is doing what he ought to be doing in some sense, is talking to the propagandists and scam artists in Washington. But then get the heck out of there. That's just a corrupting and horrible place. You walk around D.C., you just feel like everybody I walk by is some kind of a lobbyist, expropriator, looter. Very hard to enjoy yourself when you're there. All right, I want to continue talking about this Republican debate. Feel free to call in and share your thoughts, by the way. How do you guys feel about this? 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. But in particular, I want to talk a little bit about, just for a few minutes, some of the more controversial things Congressman Paul said, because really nobody else said anything controversial from what I could see. Everybody's pretty much sticking to the playbook, and there are certain things you're allowed to say. I mean, you say, I will repeal Obamacare, and everybody immediately applauds. Like, you know what the red meat is, the applause meter is telling you to do. But Ron Paul, I have to say, I mean, look, this is a guy who will look into that camera and say the opposite of what he knows the audience wants to hear. Right? I mean, he knows, here's what the audience wants to hear, and here's what every politician's job is, to flatter the audience and say, you guys are just so awesome. You are the awesomest people who have ever lived in the history of mankind, and America is the land of awesomeness, and the only reason anybody might dislike you is because of your sheer awesomeness. Like, that's what we're supposed to be fed. We're supposed to be fed this 8-year-old sort of line, and Ron Paul won't do it. And he says, look, you know, there are people who are going to do bad things to us regardless of what we do. That's true. But in terms of recruiting large numbers of people, well, I would have supplemented his answer by saying the Iranians in the early 80s the Iranian regime tried to get Muslims all worked up about the U.S. because we had women in the workplace and short skirts and the First Amendment. And it was a big flopperoo. Nobody cared. But in the 90s, you get the bin Laden types who start saying, well, look at what they're doing to us. They got troops on our holy land. They're propping up dictatorships all across the Arab world and all these other things, and that's what actually gets them going. Now, that doesn't mean you have to stop those policies. It does mean if you engage in them, there's going to be a price. And you have to ask, is that price worth it? Well, even Paul Wolfowitz, who was no pacifist, Paul Wolfowitz even said, one of the bin Ladenist grievances was precisely that U.S. troops were in Saudi Arabia. And he said that's one of the great things about the Iraq War is that it allows us to get those troops out of there and take away one of those grievances. Well, nobody said Paul Wolfowitz should be banned from polite society for saying that. He's, for some reason, allowed to say these things. But, yeah, he won't say – and he, at one point, he's actually stopped and said, look, I'm trying to explain to you what the motive is. I'm not saying that I agree with it or it's a good motive. I'm just telling you that when you do this, you got to pay a price. And you got to be truthful with yourself and ask, are you willing to pay that price? That's his question. And what most Americans don't know is that the United States was very well respected around the world, particularly in the Middle East, all the way up through the 1940s, even in the 1950s. You can see that in statements and surveys and all kinds of evidence that you could ask for. In fact, in 1920, Syria actually wanted to be governed by the United States as a League of Nations mandate. So what happened? What happened in the interim that changed that? These are the sorts of questions we're not even supposed to ask, much less answer. We're just supposed to be told, as Quiz Bowl Santorum would say, that you guys are awesome, you're hated for your awesomeness, and just keep on being awesome, everybody. All right, well, even if you don't agree with Ron Paul, how can you not respect a guy who has the guts to do that? Right? I mean, who else on that stage said anything that elicited boos? Who else would have even considered saying something that he thought might elicit a boo? Right? I mean, don't you maybe need something like that? All right. I think I made my point here. Let's listen to cut number 2, Ron Paul talking about cutting military spending.
First thing I would like to do is make sure that you understand there's a difference between military spending and defense spending. I'm tired of all the militarism that we're involved in, and we're wasting this money and getting us involved. And I agree, we are still in danger, but most of the danger comes by our lack of wisdom on how we run our foreign policy. So I would say there's a lot of room to cut on the military, but not on the defense. You can slash the military spending. We don't need to be building airplanes that were used in World War II. We're always fighting the last war.
Well, there's some common sense. Because, of course, they call it defense spending so that it'll sound like you can't – I mean, who would be against defense? What, you don't want to defend yourself? But just consider the fact that after 9/11, they created a Department of Homeland Security to protect the country. Well, what was the Department of Defense doing all those years if you need a whole new department to protect the country, for heaven's sake? But he's right about wasting money. I mean, let's not only the fact that the U.S. government is spending – as much as the whole rest of the world put together on the military. I mean, let's even leave that aside. But the fact is that the Department of Defense is the only cabinet department not subject to audit. That doesn't mean they fail an audit. It means there is no audit. So we don't know anything. We don't know, have contractors been paid once, twice, or not at all? Nobody knows the answer to that question. Since 9/11, Pentagon budget has gone up by $2 trillion over those years. $1 trillion of that went to the wars. And the other $1 trillion, nobody really knows what happened to it. Because if you look at the Army's budget went up by about 50%, and yet the Army went up by about 7%. The number of battle force ships in the Navy is down by about 15%. In the Air Force, we've got, I think it was like a 43% increase in the budget, 51% decrease in the actual Air Force. So in other words, if you spend more money, you get less stuff. Less bang for the buck, it turns out. So you're going to tell me there's no room there? There isn't even a pencil sharpener they could get rid of? It's incredible. It's incredible that we're being told these things. But he's right. Now let's go on to cut number 3, please, from Ron Paul.
Because we occupy so many countries. We're in 130 countries. We have 900 bases around the world. We're going broke. The purpose of Al-Qaeda was to attack us, invite us over there where they can target us. And they have been doing it. They have more attacks against us and the American interests per month than occurred in all the years before 9/11. But we're there, occupying their land.
So there it is. I mean, that's the issue right now. Because it is true that every year the United States government is spending about $1 trillion on defense and military-related stuff. It's not just the Pentagon budget. You got to add in the parts of the Department of Energy that are military or defense-related. You got to add in the Department of Homeland Security, because if that's not defense, what is? You got to add in the portion of the national debt, of the interest on the national debt that's attributable to past military spending. You got the appropriations on the current wars, and it typically adds up to between $800 billion and $1 trillion a year. Cannot go on forever, and you are not going to be able to solve this fiscal crisis by cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. The whole system is waste, fraud, and abuse. Oh, man. I envy Peter having the ability to sit here and do this every day. All right, listen, we're going to a break, but coming back, we got one of the best economists in the world. The anti-Paul Krugman is going to be on here. He does have a name. Robert P. Murphy, Ph.D. economist from New York University. He is the single one-man anti-Krugman industry, and he's right here on the Peter Schiff Show. Let's hear from you. Get some calls. 855-472-4433 for Robert Murphy. See you in a minute on the gold standard in talk radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
The Peter Schiff Show. We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4SHIFT.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter, and this right here, my friends, this is one serious guest, and I'm so glad he's able to be with us. It's Robert P. Murphy, Dr. Robert P. Murphy, Ph.D. from New York University, author of numerous books, including The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, which is one of the rare critiques of the New Deal that is also sound on the Federal Reserve. There have been some There's been some yeoman work done on that subject, but they're all terrible on the Fed. Well, Bob's good on everything. You can rely on Bob for everything. He's written important study guides to some of the major Austrian works. He wrote a study guide to Ludwig von Mises' book, Human Action, to help navigate you through that book. He wrote a study guide to Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, a study guide to Mises' book, The Theory of Money and Credit, where he first began to outline what we have come to know as the Austrian theory of the business cycle. You can read all this stuff, those study guides, for free at my resource page, learnaustrianeconomics.com, and you should visit Bob at his site, consultingbyrpm.com, and read his blog, put it in your RSS feed, read it every day. It'll give you a huge advantage over your peers, because Bob is like a one-man anti-Krugman industry, and I don't mean to suggest he's not doing his own positive work, but he does not let Krugman get away with anything. He has a huge article archive refuting all the naysayers, refuting all the anti-Austrians. He's like a one-man refutation machine. And you can read his article column, his article archive over at Mises.org, MISES.org. So glad to have him with us. Bob, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show.
Well, thanks, Tom, for that over-the-top introduction. Appreciate it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, now there's no way, right, the interview could be good enough. No, it's going to be awesome, because I want to start off by having you tell us, I know you've done this in the past on the show, but it bears repeating, and we may have new listeners. What's the deal between you and Krugman, and how is it that you just might be able to accomplish the unaccomplishable, which is to corner him into debating a free market Austrian economist? What's your strategy for this?
Well, sure. So Paul Krugman, as I'm sure all of Peter Schiff's listeners know, is, of course, the reigning Keynesian in the world, basically, with his perch at the New York Times. And so I heard, this is about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, that he was at a Barnes & Noble doing some, signing a book or something, and someone in the crowd was a fan of Ron Paul in the Austrian school. It was like some college girl, and she raised her hand and got his attention and said, hey, why don't you debate an Austrian on business cycle theory? And Krugman said words to the effect, in a public forum, was in front of everybody, said words to the effect that, look, I know this is going to sound elitist, but it's really just not worth my time because economists don't take them seriously. So it's just, I don't want to, give them the platform. And he moved on to the next question. So he clearly wasn't going to do it, if we just asked him nicely. So I said, okay, how can we come up with an idea? So I said, okay, I got it. What I'll do is I'll have a public campaign where people donate money, and then if Krugman ever debates me in Austrian business cycle theory, the pot of money doesn't go to Krugman or to me. It goes to a food bank in New York City. So the idea is if we can get that number up high enough, then Krugman's going to be in this awkward position where there's potentially tens of thousands of dollars or whatever the number is that would go to feed hungry people in New York if he would just take the time to debate an Austrian economist, and yet he can't be bothered to do that, even though he says they're a bunch of idiots and he could blow them up in 2 seconds.
Right. That's beautiful. So it's a lose-lose for him. Right? Either he loses to you in the debate, or he looks like a jerk for not debating and letting however much money get to the poor. What's the pledge number at right now?
Well, yeah, so if people go to KrugmanDebate.com, they can see all the details. And the pledge number right now, I just checked, is about $67,000 have been pledged. So the beauty of it is, from the participant's point of view, is you're just making a conditional pledge. Your credit card doesn't get dinged unless Krugman actually goes ahead and does it. So there's no risk if you think, oh, Krugman's probably not going to do it, then fine, then you're not out any money. So it's not like you have to give the money and then hope something happens. You're just pledging, here's my credit card. If Krugman ever does debate, then my credit card gets dinged. And so right now we got $67,000 on the line of real money that would go to this food bank in New York City if Krugman ever debated me.
Now, Krugman wrote about one of your columns at one point. He was talking particularly about your description of Austrian business cycle theory.
Right, yeah, and all that stuff is at KrugmanDebate.com. If people are interested, I put easy links to all this. So yeah, he did. This was back in February or March of this year, I think. He responded. I had written up a little story of Austrian business cycle theory, a cute little thing with numbers about some tribal village that they follow Krugman's advice, and then they don't maintain the nets in their fishing stock, and then all of a sudden they experience a recession, basically. And so it was just a little fable to illustrate Austrian business cycle theory. And so Krugman actually said something to the effect that, yep, this is the best exposition I've ever seen of this idea, of this thing floating around the Republican circles. But hey, it's theoretically consistent, and maybe that's what happened under Mao and China with their Great Leap Forward. But this isn't empirically what happens in modern market economy. So then I tried to show him that it is what happens. But he did it, but it was a good concession on his part, because up till then he'd been saying the Austrian theory was like the phlogiston theory of fire, and here he said, okay, it's actually internally consistent and maybe explains what happened in China under Mao, but it doesn't explain what happens now. So now it's just a matter of arguing over whether it's applicable or not that it's a stupid idea.
Right. Well, we would all love to see this. It would be great for the cause of truth, great for the cause of Austrian economics, and we're all going to pledge at KrugmanDebate.com, because if you're sitting there saying, oh, he'll never do it, then what have you got to lose by pledging, right? You'll never get charged. So go ahead and do it. Wouldn't it be great to have the food bank itself, once you hit like 100,000, issue a release saying, all right, look, Paul Krugman, enough's enough here, right? I mean, look, we'll pay your subway fare to get to the debate, for heaven's sake, right? I mean, let's just do this. Get us that $100,000. All right, let's switch gears here. We keep hearing on the news breaks here, we're hearing about Obama and the jobs plan. He's given a speech at a school today about it. And Peter Schiff's testifying today about job creation. I suspect there's rather a little difference in their perspectives here. What's wrong with, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. I mean, isn't Obama, at least in part, saying, look, I'm going to give targeted tax cuts to people to employers who employ more people? I mean, what's wrong with that? Don't you like tax cuts? What's the matter with you, Bob Murphy?
Well, I like just about all tax cuts. I guess, so if this were just a matter of they were going to give targeted tax cuts, we could quibble over saying, well, it'd be better to not have the government picking particular things and just giving blanket reductions in tax rates overall, that would be the best way to do it. I mean, for example, you wouldn't want the government to say, if you're a business and you hire someone named Jim Snerdley who has red hair, then we're going to give you a 1-year $50 break on your tax bill. I mean, yes, if it's either that or not doing it, sure, go ahead and do it. But you can see how that's almost like social engineering if they're really rigging the tax code with such specificity. So, I mean, that's the problem with this whole approach that they're doing. I mean, they should just be slashing spending and slashing taxes just generically rather than coming up with these little fine-tuned issues. But beyond that, the problem is, too, that they're doing things, proposing new spending and so forth. So, yeah, if it were purely just a matter of reducing taxes, I might quibble about the form of it, but I wouldn't object to it.
Now, forgive me if this is a hard question to answer on the radio, but what about let's get to a more sophisticated kind of Keynesian reply. I mean, if we keep cutting spending, if workers are required, let's say, to engage in to be subject to the sort of free market solution, which is, perhaps wage rates need to fall a bit in order to employ more people. But if the wage rates fall, then the workers have less to spend with, and if there's less spending, there's less activity, and therefore a need for less employment, and then it's a vicious, endless cycle until we're just sucked into a black hole of death and inactivity. What about that?
Well, there's problems with that on numerous fronts. So just even theoretically, and I know to a Keynesian or just to a standard interventionist, this sounds like it's heartless and cruel, but the story doesn't even make sense on its own terms, that if an employer cuts wages, I mean, that money doesn't disappear. The employer now has a higher profits that they can distribute to shareholders. Right? So it's not even true with the first pass that all of a sudden, there's necessarily less spending in the economy. I mean, you'd have to make a more sophisticated argument and say, money's being taken out of people's hands who would be more likely to go blow it at the mall and given to people who are more likely to save it. And so that would be the route you would have to take. But just more generally, I mean, there's really not – people are surprised when I tell them this. A lot of Austrians sort of just assume that the empirical evidence is on the side of the Keynesians, but just we as Austrians, we have our principles and so forth. But it's not like that at all. There is literally not a single example in history of a country that was in the midst of a big recession and then its government was running big deficits, and then they jacked up the ante and they ran bigger deficits and then quickly pulled into recovery. The only thing you could possibly point to is World War II, and as you know, Tom, as well as anybody else, that there's various reasons that actually World War II was not the end of the Great Depression in any meaningful sense. But other than that, the Keynesians literally do not have a single example, whereas there are at least 6 or 7 well-documented examples of countries that engaged in fiscal austerity and then they experienced recovery soon thereafter. So, I mean, it's not just that we have our ivory tower theory that we think small government is good and we have no evidence. Actually, all of the evidence, except possibly in the case of World War II, lines up with the Austrians when we say that big deficit spending actually just prolongs recovery and it makes the economy take more sluggish.
All right, Bob, here's your real test as an economist. Give me in 30 seconds, what ought to be done. It shouldn't take more than 30 seconds. What would you do? What would King, other than abdicate, what would King Bob Murphy do in this situation?
Well, on the federal government side, that would be really easy. I would just start legalizing all sorts of different things, not prosecute people for the drug war and so forth. That would free up a bunch of money. Start taking troops home from foreign interventions. That would free up a bunch of money. So that would allow you to massively slash spending, get rid of the income tax altogether, and have a public affairs event and literally dynamite the IRS building just to show people, this isn't a one-year exemption. This is good. And then just start selling off federal assets in order to bring in more short-term revenue while you wait for other tax receipts to recover. And that's the way I would just try to jumpstart out of this. Can you imagine the explosion of economic activity if literally people's income tax was just gone?
Yeah, that would be super. All right, we got to go to a break. I'm going to take your calls the other side of that break. Stay tuned with us here on the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show. Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter. Going to try and take some calls during this segment while we're talking to Bob Murphy, at least one, and I know we got a full board here, and we'll get to you at some point during the program. I want to try and get to a couple more topics while we have Bob Murphy here. Bob, of course, you should be following at consultingbyrpm.com, and you read that blog of his, and you just won't believe you become smarter. You become smarter just thinking about Bob's blog. It's so useful. So, Bob, I want to talk about what's the sort of deteriorating European situation. We've got particularly what's going on in Greece. 1 year Greek bonds are at 70%, and now we're finding out that the latest figures are saying they slipped even deeper into recession during the second quarter. It's just it seems like there's no way around a default, and what does this mean? What does this mean for the euro? What does this mean? Is there If Greece withdraws, is there going to be a domino effect as other countries realize, well, maybe Greece did better when it withdrew and just defaulted. Maybe we should do the same. Is the writing on the wall here? Well, what do you see going on?
Well, there's a lot of different things. I think what's interesting is if from the beginning they had just, if the European Central Bank had just said, okay, that's not our problem, it's a Greek government, they issue too much debt, they've been spending too much, and they can default, no big deal. I think if that's the way they had handled it, it might, certainly the people who are holding the Greek bonds would have been upset, but I don't think it would have threatened the euro itself, just like in the United States, like if the California state government all of a sudden defaults on its debt, it's not like people are going to say, oh my gosh, is the dollar project doomed? It wouldn't even occur to people to say that's a reflection on the strength of the dollar itself if some member state that uses dollars defaults on its own issued sovereign debt. But I think the problem is, of course, they went the route that every major policymaker has been taking since this crisis began, is they say, oh, no, we can't do that. Basically, everything has been about bailing out the big bankers, that was unacceptable, and so the ECB, backstopped Greece and Italy and so forth and Spain and started buying up all their bonds, and now they realize that's not enough, and so now the European Central Bank is on the hook, that if Greece defaults, one of the big bondholders now is the European Central Bank itself. And so then you start to get into trouble there, depending on how severe the default is and so forth, that the European Central Bank's own balance sheet is in trouble. And so I think that's part of the problem. And you're right, this issue of people are going to psychologically link it and say, whoa, the whole credibility of the ECB now just, they had their bluff called and they lost. And I think that's partly what's going on here. So there probably would be a major exit, and it is entirely, I don't think it's just mere hyperbole when people say the euro itself might collapse, because I think Germany is realizing, why did we link our financial futures with all these irresponsible governments? Let's just go our own way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the tone of what's been coming out of Germany has really begun to shift. And even though maybe there's a little bit more bluster than reality to it at this point, it seems that's the direction they're moving in. The German people at some point are going to say, "Look, enough's enough. We can't go on doing this." I want to just because I've had callers on the line here, and I want to take one who I think his question is relevant to what you and I study and talk about. Let's talk to Carl in Atlantic City. Carl, you're on the Peter Schiff Show. Thanks for being so patient.
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call. Do you have any fear at all about government confiscating our gold?
Bob, you must get that question fairly often. What do you say to that?
Well, for sure, I'm telling people they should be careful about putting all of their wealth on paper in gold ETFs and things like that, because that would be very easy, especially if those ETFs actually don't hold the physical gold. And they say, oops, actually, we don't have it, sorry. You could totally see the Obama administration just, saying, oh, well, there's a speculative crisis here, and we're going to shut down the markets for a few days and let things calm down. You can easily see them doing that. But as far as are they going to, if they just said to people, we want you to physically turn in your gold coins, nobody would do it. It would be like the government saying we want everyone to turn in their marijuana. Yeah, technically some people might feel guilty, but I think at that point people who had thousands of dollars in gold and silver coins wouldn't do it, and it would just become a black market item. So, they might pass such a law, but I don't think it would be the same as it was in the 30s. I just don't see them being able to get away with doing that in terms of the physical gold.
Carl, thanks for the call. Bob, I want to, in the last few minutes we have together, just say something about what are the prospects for price inflation. I think a lot of us expected it to be much greater than it has been up to recently, in part because the Fed creates all this money, so you expect it, but then the banks have basically held on to it and not lent it out. It has to get out into the economy before it has that effect, but now it does seem to be leaking out into the economy. What do you see happening here?
Well, sure, and you're right. That was the biggest strategic blunder that, and I contributed my own small part to this too, is right when Bernanke started pumping all that money, a lot of us were saying there's going to be big price inflation, and we weren't, we were a little bit careless in specifying exactly what sort of metrics we had in mind. And so it's true. You saw stock prices go through the roof. You, of course, seen commodity prices go through the roof, especially precious metals. So basically every price you can think of is zooming up, except the thing that the Keynesians like to look at, which is food or consumer prices with food and energy taken out, which in retrospect makes a lot of sense why those things haven't responded as quickly. But even having said all that, even those prices now are starting to rise. And you're right, part of what's going on here is that in the beginning, those excess reserves were just bottled up at the Fed, but they have begun leaking out. At least, the latest data shows over the last few months there does seem to be a change in the trend. The banks have begun lending now over the last few months, so that the outstanding loans were falling throughout this crisis, except they bottomed out and now are on the upswing in various categories of loans since earlier this year. So, it does look like there is something qualitatively different, and now banks are lending again, and so you're just going to see this flood of new money hitting the system that Bernanke's already basically, put on deck, and now it's just finally getting out into the broader economy.
We got just about another minute before I'm going to do my little wrap-up bit, but Krugman has tried to explain away things like the rise in food prices, and other Keynesians and others have tried to explain these away and say that this is flukish, or it's emerging economies are demanding more food, or maybe it's a supply issue. But as Bob Wenzel says, unless the emerging economies were just engaged in a worldwide fasting regimen and then suddenly wanted food, this doesn't seem like that useful of an explanation. What do you make of them? How do they account for the growth in these things like food and energy?
Well, sure. You're right. Krugman's basic response, the Keynesians in general, has just been to say, hey, commodity prices are volatile, and historically, if you chart changes in commodity prices, you don't see massive comparable shifts in the CPI in the future. But part of that is because when commodity prices started zooming up, the central bank would tighten.
All right, that's it for our time with Bob Murphy. Thank you very much, Bob. We are heading to a break. Everybody go to KrugmanDebate.com. Make sure and pledge to see that happen. KrugmanDebate.com and ConsultingByRPM.com. Bob Murphy, one-man anti-Krugman machine. Thanks so much for being with me. Stick around for more of the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show.
You make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on.
Call in now. 855-4-SHIP.
That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories,
Your freedom.
the Peter Schiff Show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter. Before I go to the next guest, I just have to say something about this whole Ron Paul is blaming America stuff. I mean, you got to be kidding. 10 years later, we're still talking like this? Still? 10 years later, we still talk like third graders? I mean, come on now. I mean, if a detective tries to figure out why A murdered B, and he discovers that B had a big insurance policy that A wanted to collect on, is the detective blaming B? Is he saying, well, you know, serves you right, you shouldn't have had such a big insurance policy. You were asking for it. Is he blaming B? He's just looking for motive. That's how you understand what's going on. All right, that's a whole separate show. Let's turn to happier things. And my next guest is Jeff Tucker. Jeffrey Tucker is one of the most, I don't know, extraordinary people I know. And that's saying a lot because I've been fortunate to meet a lot of extraordinary people. But Jeff Tucker is the brains and the muscle behind Mises.org, the website of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is the most unbelievable website in the history of the world when you consider how much stuff they're handing to you for free to learn from. Entire books, entire runs of scholarly journals, how many trillions of articles on every subject under the sun, and audio and video courses, and it's incredible what they are offering you for free. And it's because Jeff works all the time and is constantly adding to this, and he's an incredible benefactor of mankind. He's an author as well, and in particular, I want to focus today on his most recent book. And it's one of these. I've had people on, I've had guests on, I've been on the radio, and yet this is one of these books that it's so good, I couldn't even pick out what should I talk about. The book is called "It's a Jetsons World." It's a Jetsons World: Private Miracles and Public Crimes. It's one of these books that is filled with original insights on every page. You're absorbed by it from the moment you crack it open, and it reveals these little mini miracles, that mini and maxi miracles, that we experience every day and just take for granted. We never stop to appreciate the social system that makes it all possible. Well, without further ado, I'm sorry for taking so long to introduce him, but he's just so darn good. Jeffrey Tucker, thanks for being on the Peter Schiff Show.
Hello, Tom. It's wonderful to be here. Fun to hang out with you on the radio.
That's so great, right? It's just like we're having lunch together or something.
Yeah,
all right.
That's right.
First of all, what do you mean by "it's a Jetsons world"?
Well, so it's we live in this digital age, and I suppose that our grandchildren and their children after them will appreciate what it means for us to be alive in these times. The world has been transformed fundamentally, even more profoundly than it was, say, during the Gilded Age or even during the Industrial Revolution. We've seen just the rise of the Internet, of digital media, of the universalization of everything, so that we have infinite access to every form of knowledge, and this has dramatically boosted the worldwide division of labor, commerce in general, opportunities for all of us. And the technology is absolutely dazzling, and we're surrounded by it. We live in it. We drink it and eat it every single day, and yet we don't really appreciate it. We certainly don't have an understanding of its source, its cause, its origin, and the implications that it means for the social order in general. So the purpose of the book is to draw attention to these dramatic improvements in our life that have been caused by, that have come about in the digital age because of the relative freedom in the digital sector. And, you know, part of my argument here is that we should be experiencing growth that makes the Gilded Age look like nothing. I mean, we should be experiencing 10, 15, 20% economic growth every year because of the vast improvements of technology and efficiency. Sadly, all those stuff has been robbed by the state, which is just growing and gigantic and horrible and oppressive all over the physical world, and therefore denying us the amazing levels of prosperity we should be having. I mean, it's really ironic that we're living at a time of phenomenal social, technological, economic advance, even as young people can't find jobs, and, you know, middle class is just sinking further and further in other fundamental ways due to the nationalization of the monetary system, the heavy regulatory state, the taxes, and all the rest of it. So the purpose of the book is to draw attention to these two worlds. One, a world of freedom and explosive opportunity and miracles every second, and the other, the physical world, which is decaying because it's ruled by the state so heavily and viciously. So that's the thesis. That's the idea.
And what I love about this book is that there are great insights like this, but then you also find in the smallest areas of the private sector, you are able to draw out interesting insights. Like, just, I don't want to trivialize things, but you have a chapter in there about the olive bar at the supermarket.
Oh, yeah.
There's a new phenomenon, the olive bar. And what I love about your discussion of the olive bar is the kind of legal, I don't know, sort of ambiguity about the olive bar. Am I allowed to sample from the olive bar?
Right.
Or not? And they like to keep it in that ambiguous kind of area, and yet because it actually works for the olive bar. And but meanwhile, you contrast that. Imagine a government olive bar. You know, they cut off your hand for taking an olive.
You know, that is an interesting. See, the thing is, I do field research, right? I mean, I like to do these kind of field research. My field research in this case was at the grocery store, and I was intrigued because I had gone through for several weeks and sort of, you know, taken an olive and stuck it in my. I don't know if you do this, Tom, but what I do is I'll take an olive or an onion or whatever, and then I'll kind of feel like, phew, I probably shouldn't have done that. And so, you know, I kind of, you know, take care of my sin there. I by filling up a little bowl of olives and buying some, you know. And I did this 2 or 3 times, and I began to think, hey, I wonder if this is some sort of marketing gimmick. You know, they actually encourage you to sort of steal an olive off the olive bar, and then maybe you like it, so you buy more, or maybe you feel guilty for having done so you buy more, as a way of saying, hey, I bought olives anyway, so you can't possibly complain about my theft of the olive. So I began to interview the management at the grocery store, only to figure out over a period of time. Oh, first of all, I researched how many other people were stealing from the olive bar by hiding out in the bread section, you know, and watching. And sure enough, lots of people walking by, stealing olives and then buying olives afterwards. And well, it turned out there's a certain rule ambiguity associated with the property rights in the olive bar and the grocery stores, and they like it this way, and they actually encourage it. I got 2 different answers. So the guy at the wine counter over there said, "Oh, sure, people steal olives all the time. It's perfectly fine." But the bread lady was like, "Hey, you take our olives, you're a thief." You know, so they had points of view here. You know, so anyway, I concluded that the management here was actually encouraging a kind of sampling culture as a way of encouraging people to buy olives. And, you know, it's an intriguing example of how the private sector has so many different strategies of management. There's no final answer. You know, all you're trying to do is achieve profitability. You can't really know for sure what the solution to profitability is. It might be giving away tons of things. It might be charging lots of money. You know, we really don't know. And to me, it's a beautiful example of how the free market is a constant world of relentless experimentation, and it's a process that unfolds day after day after day. And there's always entrepreneurship, and there's constant testing going on. And yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, compare that to the stupid public sector. I mean, you only have to mention the post office as an example.
No, I know it. All right, look, when we come back from the break, we got so much more to talk about. But you're absolutely right. I mean, just imagine. I mean, but also that we don't appreciate it in the sense that we'll go up to a private sector clerk and hector him and say, I demand this, I demand that, but nobody treats the TSA that way. Yes, sir, I'll take my shoes off. It's unbelievable, whereas the TSA is screwing you and the private sector is giving you stuff. All right, more with Jeff Tucker after the break. You listen to the Gold Standard on Talk Radio, Peter Schiff Show. Don't forget, call in 855-4-SCHIFF, 855-472-4433.
But there you are. So you try hard, or you
The Peter Schiff Show.
No one really gives a good damn.
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America.
We're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods, in for Peter, joined right now by Jeffrey Tucker of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. We're talking about his book, It's a Jetsons World. Jeff, I guess I say there's so much to talk about here, so much that I love in this book, but I liked your discussion about why it's not a bad thing that we are communicating in all these interesting and novel electronic ways and social media and email and everything, and yet you've got this sort of subset of the population that sort of feels somehow dirty, that it's somehow it's too bad that we're not using a quill pen anymore and writing in cursive on a piece of paper and then folding it, putting an envelope and sealing it with wax and having the Pony Express take it somewhere. Like there's somehow something not quite as lovely about what we're doing. But you're arguing that not only is this a great thing for the human spirit, but actually it is a good rather than a bad thing for young people. Go ahead and defend that crazy statement.
Well, I would say, there's always the resistance crowd, you remember back when mass market paperbacks first began to circulate through the population, we're talking about the late 19th century. I mean, all the moms across, the country were bemoaning the fact that people had their heads buried in books rather than outside playing and, God's green earth or whatever, playing games outside. I mean, it's true. There was a kind of national frenzy about this, like, oh my God, everything's falling apart because people are reading all these cheap novels all the time. Well, it's the same thing going on right now. I would say that I think we should be so glad for social media, for email, for all the communication that goes on between people, young people today, because for one thing, it's causing literacy to be spread at a time when the public schools are completely failing. I mean, being part of social media and being connected to your friends and being in a position to constantly write them all the time, it's great practice. It's excellent learning opportunities for kids. So yeah, I mean, if it hadn't been for this, I mean, imagine how stupid everybody would be. I mean, the public schools aren't teaching anybody anything. I mean, you don't learn by just sitting at your desk listening to some bureaucrat drone on to you. You learn by doing things and being part of the world and being engaged in life. So all this technology is getting people more and more and more engaged in life, learning how to manage themselves socially, manage themselves intellectually, how to learn from others. All this stuff is great, and it's making up for the failing of public schools. I don't have the slightest regret about technology. You know what it is, Tom? It's almost like sometimes people imagine that technology sort of is like the weather, it sort of sweeps through and there's nothing you can do about it. What people don't understand is that in a market economy, there's no technology that survives that doesn't serve people. That's its whole purpose. I mean, the reason why some companies rise and other companies fall is they're better at serving people. So what is with technology? The purpose of the technology is to serve the human population. And so the technologies that have been given unto us, that we sort of inherit by virtue of the blessings of being alive, have mostly, for the most part, been created in order to serve the human population. This is a great thing, and this is one of the principles that I keep trying to make in the book. The free market serves people, and that's its greatest contribution to the world. The state is exactly the opposite. It coerces, it harangues, it harasses, it badgers, and it diminishes our quality of life. The market is exactly the opposite. So I'm just saying, let's embrace the thing that gives us social progress, that gives us what we want, that lifts up humanity, and reject the thing that's constantly keeping us down and punishing us and making the world a miserable place. And that is the state.
Now, it seems like common sense to me. I want to talk a little bit about your section of your book called Work for Free, because that doesn't seem self-explanatory, a statement like work for free. But what do you mean by that? I found this extremely compelling, especially since I find so many young people, even in this economy, you'd think they'd be grateful for a job. I mean, I'm always constantly running into surly clerks who resent being there, whatever. I mean, they could stand to learn from your book. But what do you mean work for free? What are you talking about?
Well, So, look, I'm very, very optimistic about the young generation today with all their access to technology. The thing that worries me the most is the end of job opportunities for young people. And this has been a deliberate conspiracy by the state. Child labor laws are the worst thing that ever happened to teenagers and to young teens, young adults in the history of the world. Maybe it wasn't so bad in the 40s and the 50s. These days, kids are ready to go to work at the age of 11, 10, 11, 12, 13. These are crucial times, but the state says, no, you must sit at your desk and listen to the bureaucrat drone on for the next 5 years or whatever, during the most formative years of your life. Then you've got the minimum wage, which is just a law that says we are not going to allow you to work unless you can set your price up at such a high level as to compete with workers that are already in the market. So young people are denied opportunities to even get training on the job. This is, and of course, the unemployment rates among young people are just sky high. And I worry very much about this because working is the way you learn. I mean, it's more of a school than what we call school. It's the great way you learn how to make a contribution to the stream of life itself. You know, I mean, but outside of the commercial marketplace, it's just dark and dreary and horrible. And so kids need to be involved in it as young as possible. So how do you do it? How do you do it with all these laws, child work laws, minimum wage, all these restrictions, regulations? I mean, it's so bad. Employers don't want to hire anybody anymore because they're so expensive and so costly. Well, so what I'm proposing in this chapter is that the best thing you can do as a young person right now is go out and work for free. Now, I don't mean just going to Soup's Kitchen and doing some pious, thing, that the social workers approve of. I'm talking about going to the local printer or the local laundry or the local grocery store or restaurant or whatever it's going to be, someplace that has activity and action that serves people, and jump right in and say, look, I'm willing to do anything for free at this place if you'll have me. And you'll have an exciting, a wonderful life, and you'll accumulate skills, you'll build your resume. And yeah, okay, you're not going to get any money for it right now. Well, it'll pay off down the line. So working for free is the best strategy right now. It's way better than sitting at home and playing the Wii or playing Tiny Wings on your iPhone, while you're 16, 17, 18 years old. That's crazy. You need to get out and make yourself useful and prepare yourself for life. You will give yourself an advantage over all your peers if you get to work right away, as soon as possible. The payment, worry about that later.
And also, I mean, the payment can come in the form of the most unbelievable reference letter anyone will ever write for anyone, because the employer would just will not believe what you're doing. And you tell the story about a guy who worked at the Mises Institute who just worked overtime and just kept on to try to figure out all these technical, complicated things, and you gave such a fantastic reference for the person that he immediately got the job.
Yeah, no, that happens all the time. I mean, yeah, young people need to think about the long term, and the most valuable thing you're going to take out of any job is a sincere, beautifully written reference letter. And I tell you, future employers can tell the difference between a perfunctory letter like, yeah, he worked here, he was fine, and one that says, let me tell you, this guy is just fantastic. What a great attitude, a great learner. He's willing to do anything. He always showed up on time. He completed his tasks. He didn't bug anybody. He was punctual. He was humble. He was a good colleague. So that kind of letter, wow. That's also even valuable in terms of getting in law schools or any future positions or whatever.
Yeah.
And, the experiences you take with you, I don't know, you hear people talk about this all the time. Even late in adult life, people look back on their lives and they think, where did I get my most profound formation? Quite often they talk about those earliest jobs that they had.
Hang on, let's talk about a little bit about this after the break. Listen to the Gold Standard and Talk Radio, the Peter Schiff Show. We're going to continue with Jeff Tucker for a few more minutes and then get to your calls. Thanks for your patience. Stay right there, my friends.
Sneakers, your reflection I did not see.
The Peter Schiff Show.
We were heading for the sea.
We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4-SHIFT.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter. Again, my apologies to people who have been extremely patient hanging on the line. I like to keep the calls to when they're relevant to the guest, and I'm going to spend just a few more times with Jeff Tucker, and then we'll go to the phones. Feel free to add your voice to the conversation at 855-4SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. Jeffrey Tucker, of course, Vice President of the Mises Institute, Ludwig von Mises Institute, author of It's a Jetsons World. How can people get that book, Jeff?
Oh, you can go to Mises, or you can go to the store and shop around. We've got a 15% off store-wide sale going on right now, so just load up on that and everything else you want. Or you can go to Amazon. Either way, it's great.
Great. Okay, so everybody make sure and check that out. Just one quick thing about your title, It's a Jetsons World. I like the fact that actually it's even better than a Jetsons World at some level, because one of the examples you use is that they did imagine there being like a picture phone, where you could talk to people and look at them, but you had to sit in a special chair and there's a screen on the wall, and like we would be totally impatient even with that, right? But anyway, I don't want to keep you stuck in.
But Tom, do you remember when Jane, his wife, used to answer the video phone in the morning? She put on a little mask. She had a little morning mask she put on, and so that she could, kind of look all stiffed up and everything when she talked on the phone.
Yeah, right.
Well, I don't know if you have this happen to you, but when people call me on Skype video, I find myself quickly adjusting my tie before I hit the phone. It makes me feel like Jane Jetson. Hey, but let me just say something about this too. I don't think people sufficiently appreciate just what kind of world that the digital world has created for us. I was looking through a site earlier today, and it's Amazon's sort of service for having small jobs contracted out to people in the world. I can go on there. I can just quickly register, name the job that I want. Let's say I want 50,000 photos tagged with various tags, or I need a new header created for a website, or I need a bunch of PDFs all batched up and assembled in something, or I've got a typesetting job, whatever. I can go in there, post a job, say how much I'm willing to pay for it, and within minutes, somebody will answer and do the job for me, and I can rate their service. Okay, and I can look at their past things and everything. Now, who is this person? I don't know. I don't care. I can look it up if I want. Might be somebody in Brazil, might be somebody in India, somebody in Iceland, could be somebody living in a hut in Madagascar somewhere. But it's a curiosity. Where they are, who they are, whatever. But it's not what matters. It could be anybody on the planet. Now, you can also, if you have a particular software skill, sign up as a service provider through this service. And I mentioned the Amazon service, MTurk, but there are many, many such services all over the place. Digital media has made it possible to have a global division of labor like nothing we've ever seen in the history of humanity. And that's an extraordinary thing. And by the way, these jobs, you can pay 20 cents, for having 50,000 photos, batched up and tagged or whatever. Hey, that's how low it is. If that's not the right price, somebody will pitch somebody else. This is a glorious thing. In other words, digital media has permitted humanity to bypass the state and still improve our lives. This is a glorious, glorious thing. I mean, it's uniting the whole of the human race in one magnificent commercial enterprise to lift up humanity and make the world a better place. The only thing that stands in the way is this aging, anachronistic dinosaur called the government that leeches off us like a gigantic parasite. So anyway, this is the Jetsons world we're entering into, and it's got one huge problem left, and it's all the politicians, all the bureaucrats, and all the nation states in the world that divide us. The markets, on the other hand, are working very hard to do everything we want markets to do, everything that we want to do as individuals, which is to live in a beautiful, civilized world of opportunity and creativity.
Jeff, let me add that in this world, it is so cheap for people to make themselves heard on a whole variety of subjects. I mean, all the people listening to this program are, I think, disproportionately the intelligent people in the world. Like, they've sought out Peter Schiff. They know what they're talking about. They can think for themselves. And I think some of us, some people will send out articles to their friends through email. But I say to you, shame on you. Instead of doing that, get a blog, link that article, write your own commentary about it, and attract comments. I mean, we should be everywhere. It costs nothing. A YouTube channel just costs you a camera, and you can get out there. And you gave a talk once when you said ideas. I've stolen this from you shamelessly. Ideas are immortal, and just as immortal as ideas are YouTubes. I mean, your ideas will outlive you. You have this as an no one in the history of ideas has lived in a time as exciting as the one we live in now, and we're normally very blasé about it. The second thing I want to say, and just get a little comment, is we were talking, and I was thinking about over the break, about how much more growth we should have seen from the economy. But I mean, add to that Craigslist, eBay, where you can take your junk and find exactly who wants it. Well, that would have all been wasted in the past. We're making tremendous efficiency gains, and yet the numbers, the economic numbers, don't reflect that. So in other words, I bet you what growth we've had is because of this, and if it hadn't been for these advances, we would have had the recession much earlier.
No, Tom, I think you're exactly right. In fact, it's frightening to think where we would be economically right now were it not for the Internet, for the digital age, and for everything that's happened to us. I mean, it's terrifying. We would have had the depression to beat all depressions in the history of humanity, actually, were it not for the digital media that allows a global cooperation and building the division of labor, like we've seen. But if we didn't have the state standing in the way, who knows what kind of amazing thing. For one thing, let's just mention something very obvious. The markets are capable of creating their own monetary system, and it would be a global monetary system. I don't know precisely what it would look like, but the state has prevented it. I mean, if the markets are permitting me to cooperate with some guy living in a hut in Madagascar, to help build a website, markets are capable, and I mean, all the other miracles we see around us every day, markets are capable of creating and managing monetary and banking systems also, but they're not being allowed to.
You're right. There's so much more that can be done. But, Jeff Tucker, thanks so much for being my guest. You're always fantastic, extremely interesting stuff. Everybody check out It's a Jetsons World, a great book. Get it at Mises.org. Get it at Amazon. Check out Mises.org. You could, if you wanted to be a hermit, you could live the rest of your life as a perfectly satisfied hermit, just examining all the stuff on Mises.org. Jeff, thank you so much for all the work you do, for this great book, and for spending some time with us today on the Peter Schiff Show.
Well, thank you for thinking of me. It's been really fun to visit with you and be on your show.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, let's go back to the phones here. Let's go to, if I've still got Bill in Georgia, because my call program seems to be frozen. So have I got a Bill in Georgia?
You do, Tom. Good afternoon or good morning. How are you?
Doing well, Bill. Thanks for the call.
Sometimes I've decided I'm not going to watch debates anymore. When Rick Santorum launched on Ron Paul yesterday, I went back and I thought about the air order of battle that rolled out for the first Gulf War, and I only picked 4 bases to show you why the 9/11 Commission report and the CIA said that, yes, 9/11 had to do with blowback. Jeddah Air Base. B-52s and KC-135s were based there doing bombing attacks in western Iraq. Taif, just to the southeast of Mecca, F-15Es and F-111s equipped with paveway were bombing downtown Baghdad. Khmer Mushat, F-117s were launching, and at Tabuk, RAF Tornadoes bombing western Iraq. Now, Jeddah is the principal gateway to Mecca, the holiest city in Islam. Taif is just in the same province, very close to it. Is there any rational person that would not think that Al-Qaeda and fundamental Islamists would have a major issue with the infidels basing their bombing aircraft in their most holiest cities?
Yeah, well, question answers itself.
And to have Santorum make that statement and to have Tea Partiers booing Ron Paul is so frustrating.
No, because
unbelievable.
What they want the candidates to do is to get up there and basically say the equivalent of USA, USA, and Santorum's playing the part. And I try not to call people names. A lot of radio people do that. I don't do that. But with Santorum, sometimes I call him Quiz Bowl Santorum because of his intelligence level. I find him to be a deer-in-the-headlights drone who never heard a propaganda line he wouldn't repeat 100 times and think it was an argument. So, yeah, it's very frustrating that you get one guy. And he's the only one guy in all of politics, as far as I can see. I mean, maybe a couple of outlying exceptions, who will actually sit there and say, I'm not going to insult your intelligence. I'm really going to say things that I know you're going to boo, but I think it's useful for you to hear them.
Well, anyway, I've sent this to Mike Church so that maybe he'll use this to show to his people. But we've just got to let people know that the report is very accurate. And on August 23rd, 2003, the United States removed every one of its military assets from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula after Saddam Hussein was removed from power and he was no longer a threat to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. We recognized that, and we removed all those assets from the peninsula.
Right. Yeah, just as Wolfowitz said. All right, Bill, thanks
All
so
right.
much for the
Bye-bye.
call. Sure appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Okay, we got a break coming up in just a minute, and on the other side, first of all, let me remind you, we got one last segment here, so it's not too late to give us a ring at 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. And on the other side of this break, I'm going to wrap things up by talking about, we've just had the anniversary of 9/11. What's been going on with American society since then? What kind of changes have we seen in our toleration for government intrusion in our lives? Has there been too much of that? Is there too little? Talk a little bit about that. These new Attorney General guidelines we got a few years ago for the FBI. It's all pretty scary stuff, but we'll end on a note of hope. We'll see you on the other side of the break on the gold standard in talk radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
That's a bad pun. I miss big puns. Call up my dad, huh?
The Peter Schiff Show. Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
All right, we are going into the final segment of the Peter Schiff Show today. I'm Tom Woods filling in for Peter, who is off testifying before Congress. Can't wait to see the footage of that. Just a few things to wrap up before I take a couple calls and we call it a day. Here it is 2 days after the 10th anniversary of 9/11 and the day after a Tea Party Republican presidential debate. So just a quick couple of thoughts here. Because I see a lot of Tea Party people saying that, well, of course we got to ramp up the law enforcement and spying on people. It's just, you got to do it, and we're just trying to get the bad guys, and what's the matter with you? And it's just astonishing to me that some of the Tea Party people would be so naive, right? I mean, 99% of the time they're upset at the government. The government's a bunch of liars. You can't believe a word they say. But when it comes to law enforcement and foreign policy, suddenly these very same people become infallible. Right? Anything they say, we just bow down and accept it. But in particular, with very little fanfare, a few years ago, the Attorney General guidelines for the FBI were modified so that now the FBI can actually follow you around. You're not accused of anything. You might not even be suspected of anything. None of that's even necessary. They can follow you around. They can watch you 24 hours a day, even if they just think you might make a good FBI informant. They can open up an investigation of you, and see where you go. And it's now when you think about how we've seen various levels of government in the U.S. define what constitutes domestic terrorism, and the definition is like somebody who likes the Constitution or whatever. I mean, it sounds like a regular American. How can you be sanguine about just saying, "Oh, don't worry about it"? They're not going to misuse these powers. These are our wise elected officials. I mean, they never abuse anything. I don't know. There's room for a lot more cynicism than that, I would say. All right, let's go to Bob in Virginia Beach. Bob, you're on the Peter Schiff Show.
Well, Tom, thank you for taking my call.
My pleasure. Thanks for being so patient.
I'd like for you to tell I follow you all the time on your books and TV and so forth, and I agree with you 110%. Especially in regards to states' nullification that you're promoting, and I'm all for it, but I don't believe a lot of people really know about it yet. And I just want you to make it known to the listening audience of how effective this will be and return to our first principles that our founding fathers said about having the 50 states being free and independent states and having a small federal government coming off that. Can you just go ahead and tell your audience those details?
Yeah, sure. I can give a brief overview, and then you can get I've got on my site, tomwoods.com, there are some, if you sit there and watch the different graphics flash at you, one of them is on this topic. You can learn more. But I'm arguing that since everything we've tried to limit the federal government has failed, maybe you ought to just try something else, right? I mean, the same old thing, listening to people with their 5-point plans. I think we've had enough 5-point plans to last us a long time. We never seem to even to get to point 1 of any of these plans anyway. So we got to think differently. And I'm reminding people that Thomas Jefferson was of the opinion that if you let the federal government define what its own powers are monopolistically, then it's going to keep expanding its power. It's going to keep saying, oh, my goodness, we just discovered we have another power. We have no right to be surprised at this. So Jefferson believed the states needed to have a robust presence in the constitutional order and, in fact, be able to nullify, as in to refuse to allow the enforcement of unconstitutional laws within the borders of their states. And I've heard all the objections to this. This violates the Supremacy Clause or whatever. I've answered all this. In fact, at statenullification.com is the quickest way to get to it, and you can click there on my question and answer that answers all these arguments. But it was used to fight against slavery in the 1850s. It was used to fight for free speech in the late 1790s. It was used to fight against unconstitutional searches and seizures in the early 19th century. It's been used against the Real ID Act just 6 years ago. It's been used in the medical marijuana issue. So it's really beginning to assert itself, again, because people are just frustrated and they feel like, well, even if this fails, so what? Everything else has been a big failure. But here we've got Jefferson on our side. And yes, we do have Madison on our side, even though he later changed his mind. He clearly was changing his mind. At the time, everyone understood him to mean that the states were the parties to the Constitution, that's what he called them, and that when the judicial branch betrays us, because it may, we need one final level of relief, one final defense mechanism, and that has to come, he said, from the states. Because our system does not say that presidents may be fallible and congressmen may be fallible, but judges are divine. All the branches may conspire against the liberties of the people, and that's why we need to just think differently. We have to think outside the suffocating box in which we're allowed to hold opinions that range only from Mitt Romney to Joe Biden. Well, that box needs to be crushed into the ground and set on fire. All right, Bob, thanks for the call. Let's go to Brian in Atlanta, Georgia. Brian, we've got just a couple minutes, so let's get to it quickly so we can get to your question.
Hi, Dr. Woods. I wanted to, make a comment regarding Dr. Paul's comment, but I'll just get to your question.
Okay. Sure.
Given your knowledge of history, and I've followed your work quite a bit, and it's, obviously very broad and deep, what do you see for the U.S. going forward? It seems that there's been more than enough examples in the history of nations and empires having pursued these courses, and from what I can tell, none of them end very well for anybody. What do you see going forward? How do you see this playing out, and what, if it plays out badly, what would be some signs that would make you start to think whether or not this is a place you're going to want to be when it all shakes down?
Right. Well, I am so much of a homebody by nature that I would never feel at home in any other country. So I respect people who say, look, I'm going to get out of here before the you-know-what hits the fan. That's their decision to make. I respect it, but I'm not going to make that decision. Plus, I live in Topeka with 20 acres of land. I'll be all right one way or another. We have to forage for berries. It can be done. But I think actually we are in a kind of uncharted territory. I mean, it's true there have been empires in the past that have overspent themselves and overextended themselves, but this is just exponentially greater than that. I don't think we've ever had an age in which not just the United States, but all these countries have made such unsustainable and impossible to fulfill promises. I don't think there is any precedent for this at all. And it's undeniable. If the entitlement shortfall is in excess of twice global GDP, it can't be fixed. And so the promises won't be able to be kept. And so what some people in public life have tried to say is, we're going to have to retrench domestically and internationally regardless of what you may want. It's coming. We're going to have to do it. But we may as well do it like adults, calmly, right now, before civil unrest occurs, or we can wait till the crisis really hits and the U.S. government can't afford to borrow anymore and it can't make the payments. let's make the hard choices now like adults, while things can still maybe be sort of salvaged. All right, everybody, it's been a pleasure, as always, to be here with you guys for these 2 hours. Thanks so much for the calls. Thanks to my guests, Robert Murphy and Jeffrey Tucker. To the whole crew that saw me through this morning, thank you very much. Check me out at my site, tomwoods.com, and look for Peter's YouTube. Look for his YouTube from his testimony. Thanks, everybody.
The Peter Schiff Show.
For America's wounded warriors, coming home can sometimes be a battle in itself. Making the transition back to civilian life or active